This episode of New Politics was released on the 26th of October, 2024, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
Welcome to New Politics. In this episode, Lidia Thorpe tells the King what she really thinks of him and the royal family. Is it time for a new debate about the Republic? And the community teal independent movement continues to grow. I'm Eddie Djokovic, editor of New Politics.
I'm David Lewis. My mother was a hamster and my father smelled of elderberries.
And a big thank you to our new subscribers. Your support means that we can continue to produce the weekly podcast and publish our words of wisdom on the internet, and many voices get to make a bigger noise collectively. And if it's not us, you can always support other independent journalists in the progressive field as well. Doesn't matter what you do, just do something.
It's important to have a plurality of views. In the highly concentrated media landscape of Australia, it is hard to get that.
And just our regular message, listen in, share, subscribe and support New Politics at Patreon and Substack, or you can donate at our website at newpolitics.com.au. And of course, all of this is a good way to support independent journalism.
Don't push me, cause I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under.
The royal visit to Australia is over, and once again it was a sycophantic display by the political establishment and the mainstream media when all of their critical faculties are thrown out the window and the obsequious behaviour begins.
Sydney has saved the best till last. The King and Queen greeted beside a sparkling harbour and met by huge crowds at the Opera House.
The royal couple has just finished a packed schedule from the city to Parramatta, meeting kids, community leaders, even sheepdogs.
At the Opera House, a standing ovation for the King and Queen on the final day of their quick hit tour. The King this week was made an honorary admiral of the Australian fleet. Today he got to inspect the collection of frigates, mine hunters and destroyers, knowing all of them bore his title. He said very little, but that seemed to say a lot. The Queen's first stop today, brunch, but she helped to make it first. Today's favourite, recycled supermarket salad leftovers. They gifted her a tiny teaspoon with crown and name engraved, then dubbed Her Highness
the most prestigious member of the Order of the Teaspoon.
before Her Majesty flew off a meeting with Pierre and his pet parrot, Caesar. Better behaved than the sneezing alpaca yesterday.
But the tour was pretty much a waste of time and filled with public relations opportunities and photo grabs for the King and Queen, and it was an uneventful tour until Senator Lidia Thorpe decided to let the King know exactly what she thought about his presence in Australia.
You committed genocide against our people. Give us our land back. Give us what you stole from us. Our bones, our skulls, our babies, our people. You destroyed our land. Give us a treaty. We want a treaty in this country. You are a genocidalist. This is not your land. This is not your land. You are not my kids. You are not our kids.
And this in itself brought up another debate, and there were calls from Conservative MPs and monikers for Lidia Thorpe to resign from Parliament or to be forced to resign. But when Lidia Thorpe said, "He's not my king," made a call for a treaty and called the king a genocidalist, it's all historically correct. King George in 1787 did instruct Arthur Phillip to protect the lives of Indigenous people. Well, that never happened. A genocide against Indigenous people was committed. Land was stolen from Indigenous people under the concept of terra nullius, and a treaty was never negotiated. Now, if the king wanted to make himself useful, he'd recognise and accept what Lidia Thorpe said, take responsibility for the actions of the British Empire from 1788 onwards, make a treaty with Indigenous Australia, and that would clear the pathway for a treaty with the Australia that was formed in 1901. That would be far more useful than coming over here to cook sausages on a barbecue with surf lifesavers, patting the head of Hefner the alpaca, inspecting the Navy fleet, and the endless photo opportunities. If the King and Queen are going to be useful, well, do something useful.
It was a strange tour in that it didn't seem to be a lot of enthusiasm for it. Usually a royal tour brings out seemingly bigger crowds. Now, I saw numbers of 15,000 at the Opera House, for example, but in the photos it looked less than that. And the photos were taken by the people who were telling us it was 15,000, so I don't think there was any sort of attempt to make it look smaller deliberately. There were some embarrassing moments. Yes, the Prime Minister should treat the head of state properly, but it felt a little bit more than it should have. Paul Keating was able to treat the Queen appropriately without anyone, including the Queen, doubting his Republican credentials. Bob Hawke too, Kevin Rudd. But it seemed a little bit icky. We have a king whose popularity is much less than his mother's. Queen Elizabeth II was an exceptionally popular monarch, for not all of it, but for most of her reign. And particularly towards the end, she was very loved by many people and respected even by people who weren't in any way in favour of her role. Charles is not as popular as his mother. He's an elderly man. That's not his fault, but doesn't help things. His wife is exceedingly unpopular, especially compared to his first wife. This time, my impression was that many people weren't that interested, that down to the point where I think they probably didn't need the security. And the tour itself felt unnecessary. It just seemed completely inessential, which for a head of state, and I think it may have gently opened up the Republican debate again. And the other thing I think that is Lidia Thorpe, given the howls of outrage that she got from mostly the right for how dare she, because I think that there are at least some analysts in the right who could see, hold on, there's going to be some agitation now for change again. Because as you rightly said, nothing she said was untrue. I don't think she went against the Constitution under the Constitution's implication of free speech. You can be loyal to the institution of the Crown while not liking the individual in it. And she said, not my king, which is where the thing is. But I think that she's safe constitutionally.
Well, speaking of the Constitution, a lot of MPs who seem to know nothing at all about the Constitution all of a sudden did become constitutional experts. And we had Senator Bridget McKenzie, the Queen of Sports Rorts, come out to say that Lidia Thorpe had somehow breached the Constitution, had to be removed from Parliament.
Senator Thorpe, I think, is the only parliamentarian that I've ever known to disavow their oath of allegiance to our sovereign and their heirs and successors according to law. So what she did on Monday essentially breached, and this is a question I think we actually need to investigate because it's the first instance I've ever actually experienced where a parliamentarian who's sworn that oath of allegiance has breached that oath of allegiance. And so what then is the consequence of that for our Constitution? For me, it really raised some quite tricky constitutional questions. Australians are absolutely sick and tired of people behaving badly and getting away with it. And I think it's eroding Australians' trust in our democracy, our institutions and parliamentarians generally. And that ends up weakening our nation.
No, I'd say Australians are absolutely sick and tired of people behaving badly and getting away with it. And Bridget McKenzie should be the first one to resign from Parliament. And then the big talking points were the manners and the way that Lidia Thorpe shouted at the King. And a lot of people were saying, well, the King has earned our respect. Well, not really, until he climbs a tall mountain or invents the cure to cancer or something like that. He really hasn't earned our respect at all. He was just lucky enough to be born into the right family and to be the firstborn of Queen Elizabeth II, and then he becomes the king. And that, for me, doesn't really earn any respect at all. And he's actually the one who is being disrespectful. Lidia Thorpe did request a meeting with the King to talk through these issues, and she is a member of Parliament. These are important issues, and he refused. And that's not very good manners. He's happy to meet with Hefner the alpaca, but not to meet with an elected senator in the Australian Parliament to talk about some very, very important historical issues. And maybe it's turned out better in this way because the incident has made international news and now more people are talking about these issues.
Yeah, I think she's probably done more good than harm in that the usual suspects, of course, as you said, came out and said how rude. And there was a really excellent tweet on, well, Twitter or X by the guy who runs the podcast Stuff the British Stole. Mark Fennell, that's right, yeah, which is a very good podcast that documents all the stuff in the British Museum mostly that was taken from other places. He basically said that the big lie is how polite the British are. In fact, they were very rude as colonialists. They just bowl in, strip the joint and leave. You can say what you want about the British Empire. And of course, I'm not talking about individual British people who are all, in my experience, all been very wonderful and nice people. But as an institution, the British Empire was very rude. And to talk about British politeness in that context is disingenuous at best. So that Lidia Thorpe, that her frustration boils over again, and she says some choice words, none of which have been disproved historically, by the way. And even those who said she swore an oath to the Queen, she said that she didn't use the word heirs, she swore an oath to the Queen's hairs. Again, she's not the most radical person we've had in federal parliament. On the right, you've got people like Pauline Hanson and that movement, who I would argue are at least as radical as Lidia Thorpe is to the left. I am uneasy criticising her words or actions as a white guy towards a black woman, even though she's a privileged black woman being a senator in the federal. I think that it's wrong for me to tell her how to behave. And is it how I would have done it? No, but again, I come from a completely different spot, and I don't think I can fairly criticise her for what she did. I can just acknowledge it happened and understand that for some people, that's the only way any change is going to happen.
The other point is that there's almost 1 million Indigenous people in Australia, and there's going to be a broad range of opinion out there, and not all Indigenous people are going to agree. But I think Lidia Thorpe's speech would have resonated with many people in the Indigenous community and also many people in the non-Indigenous community as well. And I think it should be up there with the Redfern speech from 1992, and it's short and pithy, and it fits right in with the shorter attention spans of the 2020s. And just so that it can make it into the school syllabus, it probably should be called the Not My King speech rather than the more obvious title. But here's what Lidia Thorpe had to say about her speech the following day.
It's just another attack to shut me down. The colonial system is all about shutting black women down in this country. They've got a very good track record of that. For those that don't agree with what I have said and what I have done, I can tell you now there are elders, there are grassroots Aboriginal people across this country and Torres Strait Islander people who are just so proud. They say that it's lit a fire back in their belly and they want to join the resistance. I've been contacted by elders who have said, particularly a Ngunnawal elder who said, I wished you had have told me you were going to do that because I would have walked right beside you and done exactly the same thing. Yeah. So I've just been overwhelmed with supporting messages. I don't listen to the noise of those who have chosen to assimilate into the colonial system. That's their decision. I've decided to be a black sovereign woman and continue our fight against the colony and for justice for our people.
And there have been those criticisms of Lidia Thorpe where she campaigned against the Voice of Parliament last year, primarily because she said that it didn't go far enough. And I don't think it can be a case where one person is responsible for the defeat of the Voice of Parliament. It's a lot more complicated than that. And Lidia Thorpe was right in so many ways. The Voice of Parliament just simply didn't go far enough. And we also have that same old Australian symbolism when it comes to Indigenous people, which is sit down, shut up and do as you're told. And we had that with Adam Goodes several years ago, and we have it again in this situation. An Indigenous woman speaking truth to power, white Australia doesn't approve, and she's escorted out of Parliament by security for speaking that truth. And it just seems to me that mainstream Australia just generally wants to hear the soft voice of acquiescence from Indigenous people, and if it's not on their terms, well, those people will be shouted down and escorted away from the scene. And also just that vision of King Charles and the Prime Minister having a smug little laugh about this incident as well, as if to say, oh, look, it's just another crazy mad woman here to spoil our big day just before we launch into some canaps and Shiraz at our lunch. Instead of the Prime Minister probably leaning over and saying, well, Chuck, you know that she's right. What are you going to do about it? Treaty now? What do you think? Maybe that's the thing that he should have been saying to King Charles.
And again, as Prime Minister, he's in a difficult position because there's protocols and what have you. But as also Prime Minister, do you support your senator, even though the Lidia is independent now and was in the Greens, so not really one of his senators, as it were, but still as leader of the government, do you support the senator saying reasonable ideas even if she's saying them?
Well, Anthony Albanese was on Spicks and Specs last week, so he probably should have launched into a version of treaty now.
Yeah. Let alone they took the children away by Archie Roach. It gets disappointing when really the commentary is, this outspoken black woman shouldn't have an opinion at all. And if there were any factual things she said wrong, that's fine. There weren't, as it happens. But the whole thing was she shouldn't have done it at all because she's not the type of person who should be going to these things, or it's not how proper people behave. And that was a disappointing thing that, I wouldn't have done it. No, you wouldn't have done it. And that's fine. I wouldn't have done it that way either. But I've had a completely different journey, if you like, a completely different relationship to the establishment than a black woman. And I don't think it's good to delegitimize someone's experience. And they don't try and extend the discussion, they try and shut it down. And I think that's a major failing of our political and media system. They don't want to talk about what they don't want to talk about. And yet that's the stuff that we should be talking about.
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis, one of Australia's top 10 podcasts on Australian politics and news commentary. You can also find us at newpolitics.com.au, and you can also support us through Patreon and Substack.
And with this royal visit has come a raising of the profile of the Republican movement in Australia. Not by much, but it has to start again from somewhere. And Australia does like to see itself as the larrikin country, but it seems like it's the exact opposite of that. It's polite to a king and an institution that represents colonialism, imperialism and genocide and historical atrocities, not just here, but pretty much every continent all around the world. We're in a position where we don't want to offend a king. We kowtow to authority. We want to silence people who speak out. We break down the power and authority of unions. We want to lock people up who protest. And this to me sounds more like a prison warden state than a state of larrikins. And back in 1992, Paul Keating had the bravery to tell the Queen to her face that Australia must move towards a republic and started the debate in Parliament in 1995.
Governments can wait for opinion to force their hand, or they can lead. They can wait for the world to change and respond as necessity demands, or they can see the way the world is going and point the way. The fact is that if the plans of our nationhood were being drawn up now by this generation of Australians and not those of a century ago, it is beyond question that we would make our head of state an Australian. Our head of state should embody and represent Australia's values and traditions, Australia's experience and aspirations. This Republican initiative is not an exercise in jingoism. It is not accompanied by the beat of drums or chess. An Australian head of state can embody our modern aspirations, our cultural diversity, our evolving partnerships with Asia and the Pacific, our quest for reconciliation with Aboriginal Australians, our ambition to create a society in which women have equal opportunity, equal representation and equal rights. It changes nothing more than what is required to make clear and unambiguous our independence and responsibility for our own affairs.
Changing the head of state, as difficult as that is through the processes of referenda, that's actually the easier part. We should be looking to reform the entire constitution, the institutions, that link between these institutions and the public, which has been broken for some time, in my opinion. We should be looking at a real republic and at real reforms and working towards a real democracy.
I think the first thing to change is consequence. Scott Morrison got away with a lot of what he got away with because there's no legal consequence. Yes, he was voted out of office. That's a good consequence. But he knew he could get away with a lot of it because the Constitution basically says this is how it runs. There's no this is not allowed. And that's because the authors of the Constitution never occurred to them that we'd have someone of the calibre of Scott Morrison in such a role. We do need to change, and it's going to take forever. And unfortunately, I think the vested interests will take charge of it. One of the problems, I think, with the 1999 referendum campaign, they had that thing in Parliament House, and it was all the same faces, and it was a diversity of opinion from basically the political elites. This is not to disparage the normal volunteers for the Australian Republican movement and other various movements, but there was very little of those. There were a lot of very wealthy people patting each other on the back, but not a lot of sounds from people for who this type of thing will be a positive change rather than just more of the same, but we can pat ourselves on the back for it. I don't know that the Albanese government will be game to hold another referendum after the Voice. So we might be waiting for the next Labor government, whenever that is. Anthony Albanese might become the longest-serving Prime Minister in Australian history, or he might be dumped after the next election, and Labor is in government but it's somebody else. And neither of those is necessarily a wish for me. I'm just saying those are the two extreme options. But I think that we're at least 3 to 5 years from a referendum, and I think it'll be a different Prime Minister, which is a sad indictment on the system.
And also, to me, Australia is a lazy democracy. It's that she'll be right approach to anything to do with politics. And I think that this approach has held Australia back. It's a democracy that makes it harder for citizens to participate in that democracy and makes it easier for more organised right-wing zealots to occupy that space. And while we haven't been watching, corporations have been strengthened, governments have become more secretive, and it's also a country that is so resistant to change. You know, when a leader starts to navigate a course that might be a little bit different, the whole place freaks out because it doesn't like to be challenged in this sort of way. And it's a little bit like when Paul Keating in the 1990s said that Australia was a part of Asia and should see its future in Asia. There were howls of protest and it was like the entire country had been insulted. But when you look at the map of the world, Asia is exactly where Australia is and 18,000 kilometres from where Britain is. So there is always a hostile and negative reaction to change, anything that's new and different. So everything ends up staying the same. And I think it's an attitude that really is holding Australia back.
It is too easy to make people comfortable and to keep people in comfort. And I know that the economy and interest rates and all of that, but the implied threat is that if we change this, you will miss out and someone else will get something that you don't have. And that's been that politics of resentment, that politics of envy is still a part of the Australian psyche. And I suppose part of it is from coming from being a penal colony. But I don't think that's all of it. I really don't. I think it's probably closer to Donald Horne's lucky country where we've been led by second-rate men of second-rate intelligence who have been able to fix the institution so it favours them rather than it favours or that it fairly distributes everything. And I think we need someone with the courage to say, let's crash through or crash, but let's really go for it. And that may well be Anthony Albanese. It may be one of his successors. I don't know. I encourage whoever it is to go for it. We've got to change the Australian she'll be right attitude in regards to this stuff because it doesn't get any better from here if we keep going along the way we have.
And we talked a little bit about this before, but any debate about a republic, it just has to be a lot more than just a change to the head of state. And I think because of the combination of neoliberalism and the electorate just not being involved in the political process very much, there has been that shift between the relationship between the government or governments and the electorate. And because that has changed dramatically over the past 40 years or so, governments at that time had more involvement in the economy and more responsibility for the provision of many essential utilities and social services. And there was that stronger link between government and the community. But today, because so many of these essential utilities and social services have been sold off and run by corporations, the job of government is mainly managing the needs and wishes of these private stakeholders, and that's through lobbyists and corporations. So governments can end up changing, which happens within democracies, but the corporations that are now running all of these things that used to be managed by governments, well, they don't change. So it's not so much a compact between government and the electorate, it's a compact between government and these corporate stakeholders, and I think that's something that definitely needs to change. So it's not just the head of state. A republic has to be a wholesale reform of what we've got at the moment. And a lot of you listening out there might be thinking, well, how do we get to that point? And fortunately, David, you and I published a book about this, and it's called Fixing Australian Politics. And we published that book about 6 months ago, but it's still going to be relevant in 20 years' time. So you can purchase this book anytime between now and the next 20 years, because these things in Australia change so slowly, and we can never have any sensible debate on any important matters in Australia because the proponents of change are never strong enough and the resistors to change are just far too powerful.
Privilege hates any challenge to its privilege, and the slightest change, which might see somebody else get something, is treated as if it's a mortal body wound to not just the individual but their family and all their friends. I do have a particular sense of pride in fixing Australian politics. And it's also the book that I hope would become irrelevant fastest. But I know in a sense you'll be able to read it in 20 years and still think, yeah, this still has to be done. Why haven't they done it? We've got to stop thinking that just because your family's been here since the First Fleet and or you're rich because your father was able to con the Commonwealth out of mining royalties, or that because you went to the right school, you're somehow smarter than someone who didn't go to the right school, despite all evidence to the contrary. Australia's got to get through this notion of really the bunyip aristocracy. It's not a term I've heard in a long time, but yeah, this notion that those who are born into it get it just by right. And again, you can't help your background. And there are some very smart people who are part of the establishment and who do very well. But it's not those I'm worried about. It's those who are there merely because of who they seem to be rather than who they are. We very rarely do things to remove them. And when we do, it's often too little too late.
This is New Politics, available through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Audible and YouTube, and also available to support at Patreon, Substack, and at our website, newpolitics.com.au.
This wasn't widely reported last weekend, but there was a tiny by-election in the Sydney seat of Pittwater, and this has been a Liberal Party heartland area forever, and this seat was won by the independent Jackie Scrooby, who was supported by the Climate 200 group and is being dubbed as a teal independent. And in the federal arena, that includes MPs such as Zali Steggall, Allegra Spender, Monique Ryan, Kate Chaney, Zoe Daniel and Sophie Scomps. And it does suggest that the electorate problems for the Liberal Party are continuing. The by-election in Pittwater, and that's a state seat in the New South Wales Parliament, it was caused by the resignation of a Liberal Party MP on child sex offences, and the results suggest that the support for these community independents that started off with people like Cathy McGowan in 2013 and then Zali Steggall in 2019 is actually growing. And all of these seats so far have been taken away from the Liberal Party, and all of these new independent MPs are socially progressive but leaning towards economic conservatism, whereas most of the federal Liberal Party under the leadership of Peter Dutton is an extreme form of social conservatism with disorganised fiscal radicalism, where they don't even know what they're doing, which is what the electorates in these blue ribbon seats are rejecting. So the opinion polls might be showing that the Liberal Party is neck and neck with the Labor government, but you'll get nowhere near being able to form government if you cannot win seats in these Liberal Party heartland areas.
People are saying, Dutton's ahead in the polls. Is it going to be a one-term Labor government? He might be ahead in the polls, but he's not ahead in the polls enough that the Liberal Party will win between 17 and 22 seats to do it. He might gain 1 or 2 seats. I don't think he'll get that off any teal. It will be likely some of those more marginal Labor seats in Melbourne's and Sydney's west, but there's not 22 of those. And if you're the Liberal Party, you can't win without Kooyong, without North Sydney, without Goldstein, without those blue ribbon seats. What we forget is that the teal movement has been successful in wealthier, more educated, or more university educated, professional seats. They're the nice parts of town. They're the elite suburbs that the teals have won. Because the people living there know what good management is, know what good politics is, and are very concerned with the environment, which the Liberal Party, the Dutton Liberal Party, don't seem to quite comprehend. They honestly believe that if they go further to the right, they will fix things and somehow become more electable. That a Zali Steggall can be defeated by a Catherine Deves, even though Catherine Deves' whole political philosophy was mostly at odds with most of the voters of Warringah. And I can say the same. Now, I know that the Teals have disappointed some of the progressive left. I'm not sure why. None of them ever claimed to be radical leftists. Many of them had voted Liberal in the past and for all their life. Allegra Spender's grandfather and father were senior Liberal members. Her father probably would have been a very important part of a Hewson cabinet had John Hewson won. That was not to be. So to come through and claim that they're these leftist radicals is just nonsense. It's about time we had politicians who had principles and followed them through, even if we don't agree with those principles. I don't like, of course, some of them have supported the genocide in ways that are extremely disappointing. But again, it's not that surprising. So would a teal movement work in Labor seats? And that's the interesting thing. I note that Simon Holmes à Court hasn't turned Climate 200 towards Labor seats just yet. He may think that there's no response in it for him. It might be harder to find suitable candidates. But I think it's important to note that Labor is losing primary votes. Liberal Party is losing primary votes. And I think the party system as we know it is dying. And this may be, to go back to an earlier point, this may be the foundation that means that we start to get real, lasting, permanent and better change in our institutions, with the structures that probably benefit most from the system as it is dying.
And I think this result in Pittwater does continue that trend away from the major parties, and this sort of now being fast-tracked by the Climate 200 group, and that's of course the one associated with Simon Holmes à Court. But it just seems that the Liberal Party hasn't got any answers to this at the moment, and it might not have any answers in the future either. And the electorate is telling them pretty much directly, if you want us to vote for you, well, we want people who are socially progressive, decent and sensible people, constructive people, and people who can work in the national interest. So what does the Liberal Party do? It presents a face of social conservatism. It becomes more right-wing, starting up culture wars. It's indecent and made up of people who are not sensible, people who deconstruct and destroy and blow everything up, and people who work in the interests of the Liberal Party, not in the national interest. So in other words, they do the exact opposite of what's needed to win back these seats. And then they scratch their heads and wonder why they keep losing seats in Liberal Party heartland areas. And you're right, David, I don't think the Labor Party can be complacent about this at all. All of those seats picked up by the community independents have come off the Liberal Party, and I think that's a protest vote against the federal Liberal Party being in government for 9 long years and behaving nothing like a true Liberal Party, and this effect seems to have lingered on, and Labor is now the party in government, and it could face the same sort of protest votes that have been affecting the Liberal Party in its own heartland areas. And I guess we won't find out until the next federal election, but it's definitely something that the Labor government does need to be aware of.
Yeah, I don't think any major party, and I include the Greens in this, can afford to be complacent. I still believe there are no real safe seats. All of the safe seats have lost their primary vote. Some of them are gone forever. I don't know that Scott Morrison's old seat will last another Liberal term. I think the only safe seats are seats where you have local members that support the local community. And even then, I wouldn't be complacent. I think another 2 elections and we won't have a Liberal Party and we'll have a very different Labor Party. Might be 3 elections. And I think the Greens is heading for a split, but that I'm less confident of. And that's nobody's fault. I don't think it's Adam Bandt's fault or Max Chandler Mather's fault or Sarah Hanson-Young's fault. I think that it's just way too broad a church and it's unsustainable. The National Party will continue on as it does till the system changes, although it'd be interesting to see what decent independents in national seats with proper funding would do. Wagga that way has lost a lot of national support, and Barnaby Joyce only has a few more percentage points to lose before he's no longer in Parliament up in New England. But yeah, the National Party is an anomaly in Australian politics.
And we have had some responses from our listeners, and there's been some suggestions that the success of the Climate 200 group over the past 3 or 4 elections, that will encourage right-wing groups to try and replicate this success. But I think we've already had that. It's already been tried out, and they just don't have the same level of support. Clive Palmer tried it out with the United Australia Party, and since 2013, they've only won the 1 lower house seat, and they've won a few Senate seats with people like Ralph Babbitt, but just the 1 lower house seat. And community independents have won 8 seats during that time, and most of those were during the 2022 federal election, and I think there's more to come. Jackie Lambie, not much success there, and I think that's because the right just seems to attract extremists who haven't really got that much to offer, and they're quickly found out by the electorate as one-trick ponies or loudmouths or people who just want to continue with attacking woke and culture war issues that no one really cares about anymore, and they generally don't last very long. But I think the upshot is, and this takes us back to the federal Liberal Party, the Liberal Party of Peter Dutton has got severe limitations, and sure, it's got success in Queensland, but that seems to be where it ends. And if you're not offering the electorate what they're after, ultimately democracy comes down to that. If you're not going to offer the electorate what they're after, you're not going to get much electoral success in your heartland areas.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think the one thing that I'm consistent on, or one of the few things that I'm consistent on, because my mind changes all the time.
Well, when the facts change, so does your mind.
Is that strong independent or strong local members will always or will mostly do well. Doesn't really matter what the party is. If you look after your seat and you are a genuine part of your community, you will do generally better than those who try and use it as a stepping stone. Now, there are exceptions to that, in that there are people who obviously should have lost their seat a long time ago because they're not that interested in the community. But that's, I think, more of an anomaly of essentially the two-party system and the electoral system than it is any proof against my argument. And in fact, when I think of people like Michael Sukkar, had a strong independent stood against him, he'd have gone last election. And one may stand against him this election. Barnaby Joyce, there's a lot of money flowing into Joyce's campaigning, and it's just enough to capture the disengaged. But again, a strong independent on either of those, and they're finished. There's no doubt. I'm told Suzanne Lay's seat is in deep, deep trouble, and Michaelia Cash might need to brush up her CV for life after politics too. But if we can get back to a place where members of parliament who spent their Saturdays going to the school fetes, opening the shopping centres, making sure that that federal funding for the main road or state funding goes through, working with the local council, helping people in distress, doing all the things that good local members do, I think the major parties will find that they will start to do a bit better. Because I think when we look at seats like Kooyong, when we look at seats like, maybe not North Sydney because it did have Ted Mack for a long time, and Wentworth has had a few independents too. But when we look at those previously safe seats, I don't think they're going back. And if they're going back, it's going to take a lot of hard thinking from the party. Putting Tim Wilson back into Goldstein, I don't know what they were thinking. He didn't come close. And he's done nothing to show that he's changed. He said he changed, but he actually hasn't shown that he has. So I guess the Liberal Party is happy at this point to keep trying the same thing till people realise that they're right. I don't think that's the way to electoral success.
And following on from last week, the ACT election did result in the re-election of the Labor government, and it will need to be with the support of the ACT Greens, and there will be more independent MPs in the ACT Parliament, and again this follows the trend of more support for independents all across Australia, and the Labor government will be in office for at least 27 years. Now that's still short of the 32 years in office for the Liberal Party in South Australia between 1933 and 1965, and the Queensland National Party in office between 1957 to 1989, but both of those long-term governments were supported by the corruption of the political process and extreme gerrymanders. But the ACT Labor government has been a long-term government under a much fairer proportional representational electoral system, and this is the result. But that hasn't kept people in the media happy, who seem to think that 27 years is too long to keep out Conservative governments. Here's the ABC's Michael Rowland suggesting to the ACT Chief Minister Andrew Barr that such a long time in government isn't good for democracy.
Former Chief Minister, Liberal Chief Minister Kate Carnell saying, in her words, you may as well not bother with democracy in Canberra. The broader point she makes is it's not great to have one party dominating any jurisdiction, territory or state in Australia for such a long time.
Well, I can tell you what is worse for democracy is the installation of terrible right-wing governments who are not prepared for office, and that's what the Liberal Party has been for a long, long time. They were in federal office for 9 years when they were definitely not prepared for office, and they have been thrown out of many states and territories for being incompetent. And this is exactly what the electorate is seeing, that many Liberal Party MPs are just no good. And far from this being bad for democracy, it's actually good for democracy. People shouldn't be rewarded just for turning up. It's not like kindergarten where everyone gets a participation prize, and that's great for kindergarten, but not for the processes of government. And political parties should present decent policies. They should argue their case for change. And so far, the Liberal Party just haven't been able to do this.
The other one, of course, is the Liberal government from 1949 through to 1972, which was 23 years.
Oh, well, I guess it is that question of whether long-term governments are good for democracy, and there is that eternal Australian sentiment about give the other side a go, but if the other side is no good, well, they shouldn't be in office.
Elizabeth Lee, I think, showed that she wasn't quite ready for the pressures of office when she stuck a middle finger up at the journalist. She apologised for it and she learned a severe lesson, and she might be ready next time. But Canberra is, as we mentioned last week, a bit more of a leftish or progressive, but Canberra leans to the left mostly. And while you have people associating the Liberal Party with Peter Dutton and his policies, even if that's unfair, even though the New South Wales Liberal Party is a slightly different beast, for example, and even if the Canberra Liberal Party is a slightly different beast, you've got the shadow of the Federal Liberal Party over all the Liberal parties in the country. And while that's there, it's going to be very hard for any Liberal Party to win in the ACT. If the Labor Party had behaved badly, corruption or malfeasance or impropriety, we might be starting to think, hold on, we're back to Joe Bjelke-Petersen or Henry Bolte or Robin Askin in New South Wales. But as far as we can tell, the Labor Party has been relatively honest, competent government, and they deserve to win. Should we talk about, is this fair? Maybe. And of course, if everyone read our book, they'd see better ways of doing things. But it's not quite. And I'd say the same if it had been competent Liberal government who'd been in for 27 years or what have you. Competence, honesty, trust goes a long way in politics. And maybe that's all you need to remember. Maybe that should be the oath. I promise to be trustworthy. I promise to be competent. I promise to be honest. So help me whoever. Maybe that should be the oath.
And finally, David, we have a Member of Parliament who has purchased the plane, and it's the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Party, Susan Ley. And it's a Cessna plane at the cost of $1.2 million. And the treatment of this is totally different to the way that Anthony Albanese and Jodie Hayden were treated over the purchase of their $4.3 million house in Copacabana by the media. And that was a narrative that ran for well over a week, and of course they are a different type of purchase. There's more of an emotional attachment to a house purchase. It's during a housing affordability crisis as well, and the plane was a quarter of the cost of that house. But the purchase of this Cessna plane was reported in the media almost like a novelty item, and not many questions were asked. We also have to remember that not so many questions were asked when Susan Ley purchased an $800,000 apartment while on parliamentary business and then failed to declare this purchase. So obviously Anthony Albanese made a huge mistake when he bought that house in Copacabana. He should have purchased a jumbo jet and the apartment on the Gold Coast and not declared any of this, and everything would have been fine.
Yeah, a plane. Interests are interests, and again, it's the optics of it. Why would
I think it is that thing about different treatment for different politicians on different sides of politics.
Yeah, no, and that's exactly what it is, that Anthony Albanese buys a house to live in and to base himself from. It's as if it's the worst thing absolutely ever. And we discussed it last week, and we got a little bit of stick, I notice, for helping News Corp. But it was something that needed to be discussed. But the overreaction to high-ranking man buys nice house for personal use properly and appropriately, as opposed to has-been buys luxury plane. And I know that the plane freaks out there say, Cessna's not really a luxury plane. Not if you're into planes, but then a Rolex Submariner is not really a luxury watch if you've been wearing Patek Philippe either. It's that double standard. And you can almost see that she tried to keep it out of the papers, but it leaks. And then the messaging comes in. She's able to fly herself everywhere rather than catch the plane. Well, what's that got to do with anything? It's still a large process. And again, if it was gifted to her, if she'd bought it with money that could be shown to be from a inappropriate donation, if there was any impropriety about it, it's probably a bigger deal. But the fact that she gets to do this and get away with it, whereas the Prime Minister has to put up with a week of speculation, it is the big problem. She can do what she likes with her money, but there shouldn't be the double standard of if one side does it, it's okay. If the other side does it, it's terrible. And that's what it gets down to.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.